Chapter 12. Dave led the family north. They trekked for an hour when Dave finally called a halt. He wanted to give the kids time to rest and drink. He asked Rhonda to check their feet and make sure they drank some filtered water. After 15 minutes, he headed out again. Movement was slow, as moving in the dark in the woods usually is. The clear, crisp night sky provided a little light, but it was not bright. Eventually, Dave cut across a trail that was not on his map. It ran in a roughly northerly direction. Dave looked up and down the trail, then took a knee. Listening for a few minutes, he heard Rhonda and the kids struggling through the grasping branches of the wood. Dave smiled for an instant. The kids really were doing well. It was rough going for a kid in terrain like this in the dark, and they weren't complaining one bit. As Dave stepped onto the trail, Dave hissed to them, "Over here." They walked a few paces to him, and Dave said, "Take a seat." They sat without a sound. Rhonda came over and took off her pack. Dave, too, dropped his pack. Leaning close to Rhonda, Dave whispered, "I'm going to scout the trail, keep the kids warm, and have Tony cover the back door." "Okay," whispered Rhonda. Dave, unburdened by his pack, started up the trail. He felt a chill as the damp on his back, from where the pack touched him, was cooled by the night air. Shivering for a second, he followed the trail slowly for 10 minutes, stopping twice to listen for unusual and out-of-place sounds. Deciding he had gone far enough, Dave stepped behind a tree that was on a corner of the trail. He could keep his trail to his immediate rear and look down towards unexplored territory. He stood for a few minutes, the only sounds merely the winds and the trees and the dead but unfallen leaves rustling from their branches. He removed his hat and cupped his ear, as before. Listening intently, he was about to return to the family when he heard something that caught his attention. He strained with all his being to make it out, but the sound eluded him. Replacing his hat, Dave stepped back onto the trail and cautiously moved forward another 50 feet, and again removed his boonie and cupped his ear. Clink. Definitely something unnatural. An e-tool on a rock, maybe? He listened for a moment, and the noise repeated itself. Dave moved up another 30 feet and repeated the action. More noises. Another muffled clink. Definitely something. Dave felt he needed to know what was going on. Was it a picket line being set up? Minefield? Were they stringing wire to channel refugees? Roadblock? Dave knew there was a road ahead. What was going on? He had to find out. Crouching and duck walking, Dave made his way forward. He soon saw white light through the trees ahead and heard the voices more clearly. A loud clunk and a laugh, then a loud voice that said something indecipherable. Dave crept closer still. He considered his options and decided to keep going. Creeping forward on his knees and one hand, he kept his rifle ready. Dave felt the footsteps before he heard them, his left hand on the ground feeling the thump reverberating through the soil. He dropped silently in place as a shadow loomed over him. Tensing, Dave watched as the man stopped and half turned away from the trail. Lit a cigarette in his mouth, the man unzipped his fly and took care of business no more than 5 feet away from Dave. He took a few puffs of his smoke and flicked the butt out into the woods. "Dumbass," thought Dave. Such a careless act could set the whole wood on fire. A voice called out, and the man answered in a guttural tongue that Dave thought was German. "Son of a," Dave said to himself. The man finished and turned to go. Dave was up faster than he realized, bringing the Belgian-designed rifle up over his shoulder, and before the German's brain registered a noise behind him, Dave smashed the buttstock down on the man's head where it met the spine. The man dropped like a rock. Dave brought the rifle down again on his temple. Then he whipped out his Spyderco and stabbed downward using an ice pick grip and plunged the blade up to its hilt in the man's temple. Breathing deeply, Dave looked down. The man was clearly dead, his head slightly misshapen in the dim light. He turned as a voice called from the road, "Uter! Uter!" Dave heard a man walking towards him. The man called out with words Dave didn't understand. Hogan's hero's German was all he knew. And kept coming, pausing to light a cigarette of his own. Juder, was is lost? Dummkopf. He finally said something Dave understood. Dave shifted right, screened by a small tree, hopefully enough to break up his dim outline. That, coupled with the fact that the man just held a flaming lighter inches from his eye, gave Dave what he hoped was an edge. The man tripped over the unfortunate Juder in short order. Regaining his footing, the man kicked him, laughing. Another blast of unintelligible words, except Dave heard Arschloch, and knew what that meant. The soldier bent over his supine companion. Juder! He bent lower, and Dave played Smash the German round 2. This time he pounded the guy's head a few extra times, as his Spyderco was still embedded in Juder's thick Bavarian skull. Dave stepped over them and took a knee, watching the white light. He saw no shadows, heard no voices. Dropping prone, he started crawling and stopping, listening for someone else. He finally made the road. Parked before him with its headlights on was what Dave thought by its shape a German Jeep like he saw on the highway. Sleeping in the front seat with his boots on the dash was another soldier wrapped in a parka. Dave stepped towards him. The man stirred at Dave's steps on the road and spoke without opening his eyes. Juder, he began, and then spoke a string of words Dave didn't catch. Dave looked around and saw an open toolkit next to a flat tire. Conveniently, there was a large hammer laying on the ground next to it. Dave picked it up, a wrench clinking to the ground. Juder, blah, 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 spoke the man. Dave walked up to him. It's not Juder, it's Dave, said McGrath, and swung the hammer. Dave cleaned up the scene a bit and turned off the truck lights. He radioed Tony and asked him to come up the path with Dave's ruck if he could do it. Dave would meet him on the path. Dave took his pack from a puffing Tony, thanking him. He took him aside and said, I got us a truck. How? Asked an awed Tony. The previous owners no longer needed it. A pause. Okay, what are we going to do? Dave smiled in the dark. Road trip. Dave led the family back up the trail, encouraging them with the thought of a ride. David stripped the men's bodies of everything. They had 3 G36s, 22 magazines for them, and an MG3 mounted on top of the truck with 600 rounds. Dave would play with the radios later. There were several in the vehicle. Tony repacked and stowed the tools in the back, and then he and Rhonda rounded up the kids. Dave was consulting some captured maps under the light of the Firefly. I think we can make it a few miles tonight. This road here, he said, pointing to a spot on the map, was never paved. It's used as a bike path, and it doesn't pass too closely to any roads. We can take it to here, where it ends in a park. We can ditch it there and keep walking. It will put us 10 miles ahead of where we would be otherwise. Tony spoke up. I thought the roads were dangerous. They are, answered Dave. Then aren't we better off walking? No, for several reasons. One is that our present rate will be out of food before we get there. The other is that the kids are exhausted and we can cover ground more quickly and hopefully cut a day of travel and cross the river without much trouble. Also, one of the guys here had this map which showed checkpoints. The next one is a mile from where we are going, but further on. If we meet any other vehicles, we'll just wave and keep going. That's why we're going to wear their jackets. Okay, that sounds reasonable. I hope you're right. So do I, thought Dave. Dave tuned the German radio and found that the second one he tried would broadcast on his group's emergency frequency. He keyed the mic. CQ, CQ, CQ. This is 2 November Sierra 1, 2 November Sierra 1, calling 4 Papa 3 Alpha, 4 Papa 3 Alpha. Come in, over. Dave waited a minute to hear the reply. 2 November Sierra 1, this is 4 Papa 3 Alpha. Read you 7x4. Go ahead, over. Everything's okay. 4 of spades, 7 of clubs, and foxes in the hen house. Over. Copy you. 4 of spades, 7 of clubs, foxes. Over. 2 November Sierra 1 out. He changed the frequency on the German radio and set back. The first number set was his ETA. The second let the group know he had 6 people with him. Clubs for extra personnel. They were hoping for this to be his in-laws with him. Foxes, of course, were occupying troops. He had kept the transmission short and to the point for safety reasons. If the military could direction find him, based on his transmission, they could dispatch troops after him. Dave didn't know if they were to that point yet, but he wasn't going to take a chance. Since he would soon be several miles from here, he chanced the contact. Dave hid Rhonda, the kids, and their packs under the German gear. The 3 Germans had been carrying Mermite cans of hot food, probably to the next checkpoint. Dave decided they'd eat later. Driving with lights on made Dave feel especially vulnerable, but he knew that he would be more suspicious driving without lights or under blackout lights. That would create suspicion. He made the turnoff he wanted in less than 10 minutes and was soon stopped in front of a locked gate. Leaving the vehicle running, he got out and examined the gate. Steel tubes, square in profile, a heavy chain, and a master lock. Dave went back to the rear of the vehicle where Tony was both speaking to his kids and watching their backs. "Tony, can you look at the gate and tell me if you think we can open it?" "Sure," Tony answered. He kissed his wife and ran around to the front. "How are you guys doing?" inquired Dave. "Okay, I guess," said Rhonda. "The kids are a little cold, but this beats walking." "It sure does. If they need to go, let them, but don't wander off, all right?" "Sure, Dave, sure." Dave heard a creaking and turned to look up front. There was no gate blocking their path. He met Tony at the front. "That was quick," Dave said. "How'd it go?" Tony laughed. "There was a key under a fake rock at the bottom of the gate post." Dave laughed. "I'll pull through. Lock it behind us and keep the key." They drove as far as they could using only the blackout lights. The only iffy part was crossing an old railroad trestle that spanned a steep banked river. Dave had been dreading having to ford it. The truck barely fit, and he had Tony guide him while Rhonda and the kids crossed on foot. Once over the bridge, they loaded back up and drove to a small park. From the park, the path continued, eventually reaching the terminus where several trails branched out, some going in loops, one a fitness trail, and several connected to longer trails, including 2 that went to New Hampshire. One of these routes is what Dave had intended to take. He had hiked both ways previously, but this trail was a little more off of the beaten path, and had several side trails that led to scenic vistas, ponds, and a small waterfall. He felt that the side trails would offer escape and evasion routes and better opportunities to find secure campsites. It also had more water sources. The park where they left the truck, though, was about a mile south of this. From this area, too, several trails broke off, including one that went northwest to western Massachusetts and then Vermont. They went over the vehicle as best they could. Dave disabled the radios. He would have to skip going over them and settle for wrecking them. While suggesting to Rhonda and Tony that they feed the kids from the Mermites, Dave drained the oil from the engine into one of the Mermite can's lids. He did this by pounding his knife through the oil pan and making a hole. From the deceased German's backpacks, he secured 2 heavy fleck-darn ponchos. Using the shovel from the truck's toolkit, he had Tony help him dig a hole in the woods. He wrapped the MG3 and 1 G36 in a poncho, after covering them with motor oil. He then wrapped the other poncho over that package and buried them with the ammo. He camoed the hole as best he could under the circumstances. Salvaging what they could from the truck, they refilled all their water bottles from 2 cans carried with the food and added a few U.S. MREs in the truck to their packs. From the packs, they also salvaged a fleck-tarn poncho, some S-bit tablets, and a stove for Tony, some paracord, toilet paper, a couple of butane lighters, pocket knife, a compass, and fixed-bladed knife for Tony, and two of the other G36s, and 14 magazines for Tony and Rhonda. They discussed switching their rifles out with those of the Germans, and finally convinced him that they were better off with the H&K rifles. Dave suggested giving Jake the SKS to carry, and Julia, the older girl, the 1022. Julia was reluctant to carry the gun, stating very loudly to her mother, "It's heavy and I hate shooting. I don't want to do it." As Dave was nearby, he leaned over and said quietly, "Julia, we really need you to do this and to help out your folks." Julia immediately clammed up and nodded her assent, taking the rifle from her mother and hurrying away from Dave. "You sure have a way with the kids, Dave," said Rhonda. "What did you say to them?" "I don't know, Rhonda. I never really talked to them outside of yours and Tony's presence. If I find out, though, I'm using it on my kids." They both chuckled quietly together. They carried the German rucks away from the truck and buried them too, more to deny their recovery by the UN troops than for a real hope of saving them before the ravages of weather destroyed them. Some pieces of gear they used, stuffing them into their packs for later. Ammo pouches, canteens, first aid kit, 2 G36 cleaning kits, a couple of smoke grenades, and 6 fragmentation grenades. Tony quickly poured a few handfuls of sand from a nearby sandbox into the fuel tank of the truck, and they set out up the path. Moving with purpose, they made good time. It took Dave a few minutes searching in the dark to find the right trail, but they were soon on their way. The going got steep in several places, with Dave and the couple helping the children up the more difficult points. They managed about 3 miles, turning roughly west down a side trail that led to a clear pond, which was another 4 miles or so. Dave knew of another trail that branched the one they were on and led to an old farm site. Nothing remained but a few apple trees and a foundation, and the path to it was nearly overgrown. That's where Dave planned on lagering. As they moved, dawn approached. First, the air got still, and then slowly they began to see more of their surroundings in gray and blacks. Slowly, they could distinguish colors, and the birds started their song again. Stopping for a breather for the kids, Dave assured them that they were a half hour or so away from a day's rest. Rucking up again, they set off, Dave concerned because of the ever-rising sun. Within 25 minutes, they reached the area Dave had in mind. He dropped his ruck and asked Tony to once again watch their back trail. He did a quick recon of the area and found a dry spot between a stand of rhododendrons and a copse of small pine trees. He moved the family into the small area with a noted sense of urgency. He didn't like to be exposed in the daylight like he was. After setting up shelter with the now 3 ponchos, Dave ate some of the German food that Rhonda had thoughtfully saved for him in her enamel cookpot. "I saw you didn't eat, Dave, and thought you'd like some." Dave agreed that he would and thanked her sincerely. He was famished. While Dave ate hungrily, he watched the family lay out their sleeping pads and bags. The girls went into the pines for a few minutes and came back dressed in dry sweats. The men changed while the girls were gone. "Dave," said Rhonda when she came back, "I know why the kids have been so good." Dave looked at her quizzically. "When you told them about the Indians scalping us if they caught us, somehow they heard that you would scalp them. They've been afraid to get you upset ever since." Dave looked at her confused. "I'd never hurt them," he began. "I know you wouldn't," said Rhonda, smiling, "but this is the very best they've ever acted. Let's not tell them until tomorrow, all right?" Dave nodded his assent, yawning. "Sure. Let's look at your rifles and I'll tell you how they work, then I'm going to sleep. We can make a guard roster and rotate, but I'm going to drop if I don't crash right away." Rhonda and Tony sat with Dave, and he went over their new rifles. One was a G36K, the short-barreled model. Dave hadn't noticed last night in the dark. He made sure that Rhonda was assigned the K, as it was marginally lighter and more compact with the stock folded. He showed them the dual-purpose sights and went over loading, reloading, and sighting. He emphasized that they should never use the full auto feature, as it would drain their limited ammo supply and endanger their kids. They worked out a guard schedule in which Dave would be awakened at 11:45 for his daily radio contact, and then Dave slept, his dreams haunting him with the sound of Uter's skull breaking, the hammer blows, and the smell of burnt flesh from his in-laws' house.